Hi, I'm Professor Helen Smith from the Department of English and Related Literature at the University of York, and I'm giving a lecture today on the Duchess of Malfi. All wickedness is but little to the wickedness of a woman. What else is woman but a foe to friendship, an unescapable punishment, a necessary evil, a natural temptation, a desirable calamity, domestic danger, a delectable detriment, an evil nature painted with fair colours. Women are by nature instruments of Satan. They are by nature carnal, a structural defect in the original creation. These are words from the Malleus Maleficarum, a vast, originally Latin treatise containing writings on witchcraft. And its 6th chapter spends its time explaining why women are the ones who are most likely to succumb to the devil's wiles. This was a period, after all, during the Renaissance, when women were understood largely as being secondary to men, subsidiary, and possibly also naturally evil and subject to temptation. So what I want to ask in this first section is just how plausible this is as a picture of women at the time. Was this really what the Renaissance thought about women? Is this really how we should be thinking about women as we approach Elizabethan and Jacobean plays? How much as well is this a description of women, and how much is the problem in this passage from the Malleus Maleficarum actually the men who find that they can't resist women and can't leave them alone? Now, this was a period which certainly was deeply interested in the nature of the sexes and the difference between them. There were lots of debates around creation, lots of debates around how men and women had come into being, not helped by the fact that there are 2 slightly different accounts of this in Genesis in the Bible. The idea was that Eve had been born from Adam's rib, and more than that, that she'd been born from the lowest floating rib, one which was naturally crooked, meaning that she herself was eminently defective. But there were also defences of women, also people who wanted to stand up and say that Eve was much better than she was depicted in many sources. Feminist poets like Emilia Lanier, who stood up to say that actually the problem was Adam, who had succumbed to Eve's temptation when he was the one who should have known better and looked after her in the first place. So there are a range of stereotypes, defences and attacks on women circulating during the period, and the plays of this period reproduce them, play with them, invert them and complicate them in all sorts of interesting ways. And what I'm going to talk about in this section as we lead into the Duchess of Malfi is just a couple of other plays alongside it, which might help us to think about how the Renaissance stage thought about women and the kinds of question we might bring to bear on our reading of this play. So first of all, let's think about language. The stereotype from this period is the idea that women were supposed to be chaste, silent and obedient. They were meant to not be sexually active, they were meant to keep their mouths closed and not spend too much time talking, and they were meant to do what they were told. But one of the questions that critics and historians have raised is, why did people spend so much time insisting that women were supposed to be chaste, silent and obedient if they really were? Or is the fact that lots of male-authored conduct texts talk about how well-behaved women should be evidence that women were much less ruly than men would have liked them to be at various moments in Renaissance history? So one Webster play, another Webster play rather, The White Devil, the other of his kind of famous pairing of plays, The White Devil and The Duchess of Malfi, has as its protagonist another Italian woman, Vittoria Colombo. She's passionate and she's powerful, and she defends herself forcibly and movingly in court with a real mastery of the kinds of rhetoric needed to defend her case and talk about how she has been subject to the wrongs of the men around her. So it's worth thinking about language and what happens to language on the stage in particular, when women are given the opportunity to stand up and speak for themselves in front of the large audiences of Elizabethan and Jacobean playhouses. A collaborative play from 1621 called The Witch of Edmonton sums up these ideas in a really fascinating speech. So there's a woman called Mother Sawyer, an elderly woman who is deemed to be a witch. And since everyone's so busy calling her a witch and saying that she's a witch, she decides in the end that maybe she ought to be one. But first of all, she questions why people are so rude and so horrible about her. And why on me, she says. Why should the envious world throw all their scandalous malice upon me? Because I am poor, deformed and ignorant, and like a bow buckled and bent together by some more strong in mischiefs than myself. Must I for that be made a common sink for all the filth and rubbish of men's tongues to fall and run into? Some call me a witch, and being ignorant of myself, they go about to teach me how to be one, urging that my bad tongue, by their bad usage made so, forspeaks their cattle, doth bewitch their corn, themselves, their servants, and their babes at nurse. This they enforce upon me, and in part make me to credit it. So what she says is that when people call her a witch, she almost starts to believe it herself. But she also speaks really effectively about language in this passage. So partly, witchcraft is concentrated in the tongue. What people are accusing her of is using the kind of language, a bad tongue, that will forspeak, that will curse their cattle, their corn, their servants and their babies. It's language that is the magic that will bring harm to those around Sawyer. But she also shows us that this magic is at work in men's tongues. In the earlier part of the speech, she talks about the idea of the filth and rubbish of men's tongues coming together in her as a common sink, a really powerful and potent image that suggests the harm that language ill-employed can do. And you might also want to think just briefly about how articulate Sawyer is at this moment. As a woman on stage who is complaining about the ways people speak about her, she's also got the peculiar privilege in this period of being a woman speaking alone in a public place, in the context of the Jacobean playhouse. Now this is a theme that runs across plays in this period, the idea of what women's speech can do. In Measure for Measure by Shakespeare, Lucio tells Isabella, "Our doubts are traitors and make us lose the good we oft might win by fearing to attempt. Go to Lord Angelo and let him learn to know when maidens sue, men give like gods, but when they weep and kneel, all their petitions are as freely theirs as they themselves would owe them." This is partly about women's language and how persuasive it can be. One of the parts of rhetoric, which was the educational system and the system of speech that governed much of the Renaissance, looking back to the classical world, was precisely about the ability to move emotions and to make people feel things. And women were understood to have a particular ability in this brand of persuasive emotional rhetoric, able to speak directly to people's feelings and make them change their minds and their ways of being, as we see happening in Measure for Measure in sometimes unpredictable ways. In the Duchess of Malfi, of course, the voice outlives the woman. So you might want to think about how the Duchess of Malfi is a powerful and confident speaker on her own behalf throughout the play, but also about the way that her voice persists after she herself has died. Delio describes the way in which a building, the building in which, but next to which the Duchess is buried, grew from the ruins of an ancient abbey. And to yon side of the river lies a wall, piece of a cloister, which, in my opinion, gives the best echo that you ever heard, so hollow and so dismal, and withal so plain in the distinction of our words, that many have supposed it is a spirit that answers. We are, of course, supposed to believe, I think, especially when we see the scene play out in which Antonio hears the echo and is warned by it to flee, that this is a spirit rather than a natural echo, that it's the Duchess's voice that continues to speak and to resonate after her death in ways that still have the capacity to shape the action of the play. I'd go back to Measure for another example. So Duke Vincentio hears Isabella coming and he cries out, "The tongue of Isabel! She's come to know, if yet her brother's pardon be come hither, but I will keep her ignorant of her good, to make her heavenly comforts of despair when it is least expected." Isabella becomes her body part, she is her tongue, and that is one thing that you might also keep in mind in relation to women in Renaissance drama more generally, the extent to which their attention is drawn to their bodies as they move and act on stage. But what we must remember when we think about this and the ways in which the language of women is tied to their tongues and to their bodiliness is that no women actually did appear on the Renaissance stage. All of the parts of women, with very rare exceptions, were played by boys and young men. So, in the words of the critic Dimpna Callaghan in her brilliant book Shakespeare Without Women from 2000, we've got to remember that whatever alleged exceptions might have existed in early modern culture to the implicit but nonetheless systematic prohibition against female mimesis, that is, against female acting, there were no women on Shakespeare's stage. Now, Callaghan goes on to say something quite complex. She says, "The crude category of women, defined only by biology and outside the text and insulated from the ways in which cultural representations produce and reinforce assigned subject positions, is a classification of no more substantial existence than the most outlandish fiction." What she means is that when we look at women on the stage, we have to remember that although we have ideas about women and what they mean, the early modern stage reveals these to be only ideas and constructs, not things which are really present on stage. So we look at the women of Renaissance drama with double eyes, both as real women out there in the world engaged in particular kinds of relationship, but also as showing us how constructed femininity is and how gender itself and even sexuality and sex might be things that can be played with and remade in exciting and challenging ways. So how does the audience respond to this play, The Duchess of Malfi? Criticism has tended to read the Duchess straight, by which I mean that criticism tends to think about her as a real woman in some sense, based as she was on a historical woman. I think the play largely does ask us to do that and asks us to think about her as a historical female figure. But of course, the body that we keep being directed to in the play was never properly straightforwardly female on stage. So there's always a tension between what's talked about in this play that's deeply intimate and asking us to go back to bodies again and again, and what gets seen by an early modern audience. And that's worth bearing in mind, thinking about the complexity of the representation of gender and of women on the Renaissance stage, and the way in which women constantly subvert and move beyond our expectations in challenging and exciting ways.